Hi, Modern World History students. Welcome to Unit number 8, the Second World War. This is section number 1. These first few sections will focus on how the war began, why it happened. And section number 1 focuses specifically on the rearmament of Germany and British and French appeasement. So we'll have to explain to you what appeasement means, and we will. By the end of this section, I hope you'll be able to explain how Adolf Hitler and Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles. That is, the treaty that had ended World War I. And I hope you'll be able to explain why the Western democracies, mainly the United Kingdom and France, pursued a policy of appeasement when confronted with Adolf Hitler's demands. So these first two terms to know, rearmament and remilitarization of the Rhineland, focus more on that first item to explain, for that first concept to explain. The second two terms, pacifism and appeasement, are related to the second concept. So let's start with Hitler's violations of the Treaty of Versailles, and we're at the top of page 5. So you remember that the Treaty of Versailles was absolutely hated by the German people. Remember that it had been imposed upon them. Germany had no representatives at the Paris Peace Conference to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. They were not invited. Instead, that treaty was negotiated among the victorious Allied powers and then essentially crammed down Germany's throat. Remember that the British had a naval blockade on Germany during the war, and that naval blockade had partially resulted in the deaths of 400,000 German civilians due to starvation and malnutrition. After the treaty was negotiated and its terms were revealed to the German representatives, the British said, "Sign the treaty. And until you sign the treaty, our naval blockade will remain in place." And so the perception, both of people in the German government, the new government of the Weimar Republic, and certainly among the German people, was that this was a forced peace, a peace treaty that had been forced on them. And it was. It wasn't one that they had a lot to say about. And despite that fact, the German people had blamed their own government, certainly for complying with the terms of the treaty, and that had contributed to Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Hitler had focused when he was appealing to the German people on behalf of the Nazi Party on overturning the treaty. And once Hitler became chancellor, and then after Paul von Hindenburg died and the offices of chancellor and president were merged into one, Hitler had kept his promise to the German people. He repudiated the Treaty of Versailles. That is, he said, Germany will no longer abide by the terms of this treaty. And he immediately began violating the portions of the treaty which forbid Germany from rearming, that is, building up its military again. So, for example, under the terms of the treaty, Germany was not allowed to have an army larger than 100,000 men. Hitler, of course, immediately violated that treaty, doubling the size of the army to 200,000 men, which was still a relatively small army, but he was on his way to doubling it again and again. So, and he did so through what is called conscription, or a draft, and that too was explicitly prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler argued that this was necessary for the economic recovery of Germany from the Great Depression. It was certainly true that by doubling the size of Germany's army and then doubling it again and again, he was helping to eliminate unemployment. He also created what was called a sort of a workers' corps. We had something like this in the United States. It was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was doing this to help put young men to work during our Great Depression. And both the CCC and the German Workers' Corps was for young men, and they were given jobs doing things like planting trees and cutting fire roads through forests to give access to firefighting, that kind of thing, outdoor work. And it also involved physical activity. The difference in Germany was that it also involved military training. The young men who were part of the German Workers' Corps were also doing military training, whereas in the United States, it was limited to physical training. So Hitler began rebuilding Germany's army, and he began converting some of the civilian manufacturing over to wartime production, cranking out trucks and artillery and tanks, as you see here. He went beyond that as well. Remember that the terms of the treaty disallowed Germany from having any ocean-going warships. They were allowed what would be essentially termed a coast guard, small ships that could patrol the coast and protect the rivers from piracy, say. But they were not allowed to have an ocean-going navy. Hitler immediately ordered the construction of two large battleships that would actually exceed in size any battleship in the British Navy. The treaty also forbade Germany from having an air force of any kind. Hitler violated this as well, ordering the construction of German warplanes. And the treaty disallowed Germany from having any submarines, and Hitler ordered the construction of submarines as well. Interestingly, though, he kept this secret, whereas all of these other things, rebuilding the army through a draft, building tanks, trucks, artillery, two big warships, airplanes, those were all pretty much done out in the open. But the construction of new submarines he was able to keep secret. It's interesting to note that he didn't want to alarm or anger the United States. And again, all of these were violations of the Treaty of Versailles. So you say, well, what about the British and French? After all, it was the British and French who really insisted on these terms being included in the treaty. This was not part of Woodrow Wilson's Peace Without Victory, his 14 points, disarming Germany. That was something the British and the French demanded. So what did they have to say about all this? Well, not much. The British and the French by now were coming to see the terms of the Treaty of Versailles as perhaps unfair, perhaps too harsh. And so many people in the British in Britain and in France dismissed Hitler's reconstruction of the German military and said, well, after all, Germany is an independent country. It's an independent country, and how can you really tell an independent country that they are not allowed to have an army or a navy or an air force? And so the British and French sort of let it go. They accepted Germany's reconstruction of its armed forces simply because they said, you can't reasonably tell an independent country that they can't have a military. Now, this was the first in what will be a series of backing down by the British and the French, backing down from the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, backing away from confronting Hitler and the Germans when they did things that were aggressive or dangerous. And this was the beginning of what is called appeasement. And we'll get to appeasement in a moment. But it was not the last. It was the first step down that road, but it was not the last. And so now we're going to move on to the box at the bottom of page 5. So there was a territory in Western Germany, which was called the Rhineland. And it was called the Rhineland because it was along the banks of the Rhine River. So the Rhine River, if you see my little arrow here circling around, the Rhine River flows right through here. It sort of goes along this border between Belgium and the Netherlands, and then it flows into Germany, and then it turns south like this. So this area, which is boxed in with this yellow box, so Germany here on the map is filled in with red. Okay, that's Germany itself. And this little yellow boxed area is the territory called the Rhineland, the territory along the Rhine River. You'll notice that this territory also borders the Netherlands and Belgium and France to the west. Okay, this territory was declared by the Treaty of Versailles to be a demilitarized zone. Demilitarized. In other words, Germany was forbidden to have any soldiers there, any military assets of any kind there. The idea of demilitarizing the Rhineland was that Germany then would not have any military immediately across the border from the countries that it had invaded in World War I, Belgium and France. And so this was meant to provide some security to Belgium and France against a potential future German invasion. If Germany wanted to invade Belgium and or France in the future, first they would have to move across this demilitarized zone. They would have to move their soldiers into the demilitarized zone. And keep in mind that back then, at the end of World War I, when this term was added to the Treaty of Versailles, Soldiers moved slowly. They moved by foot. Remember how slow moving the First World War had been. Um, and so it would take Germany some days if they wanted to move forces of the German army strong enough to invade Belgium or France. It would take them some days to move those forces into the Rhineland. And that would then provide both Belgium and France with some sort of heads up, some sort of advance warning that a German invasion was coming, and so they could be prepared for it and not caught by surprise. So that was the entire purpose of requiring the Rhineland to be demilitarized, that is, free of German soldiers. And this was included in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, in March of 1936, Adolf Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. He ordered 20,000 German soldiers into the Rhineland. Again, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, he had repudiated the terms of the treaty. He said Germany wasn't going to abide by the terms of this treaty any longer. And you can see that the German soldiers moving into the Rhineland were greeted with cheers and sort of this young lady handing out flowers to a German soldier. The Germans who lived in the Rhineland were delighted to see German troops return. And you have to remember that about the Rhineland. German soldiers re-entering the Rhineland were not invading foreign territory. They were moving into territory that belonged to Germany and was inhabited by Germans. It had simply been territory into which German forces had been prohibited, the entry of which into this area had been prohibited by the treaty. So these were not Germans invading a foreign country. These were 20,000 German soldiers moving into a part of Germany from which they had been vacant for 15 plus years. So the number of German soldiers, 20,000, you have to understand, underlines that this was more of a symbolic move than anything else. If France had been determined to remove these German soldiers, it would have been very easy for them to do it. The French had 10 times 20,000. They had 200,000 soldiers available that they could have used to move into the Rhineland and enforce the terms of the treaty. They could have easily ejected these 20,000 German troops from the Rhineland by use of force had they wanted to do it. And Adolf Hitler understood that. Later on, he said to his advisors, if the French had then moved into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tail between our legs. Like a dog, right? Like a beaten dog. And so Hitler fully understood that this act was a gamble. He understood that he was gambling, and if the French had decided to take action, they certainly could have driven his 20,000 soldiers back out of the Rhineland easily. But they didn't do it. The French chose not to act. They chose not to respond to Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland. Britain was the same way, the United Kingdom. The French were determined to act only in conjunction with the support of the United Kingdom. And the British showed no interest in taking any steps to drive the German soldiers back out of the Rhineland. The argument in Britain was much the same that had been made about Germany rebuilding its military. That after all, how could you reasonably argue? How could you reasonably say to a country that was an independent country, a self-governing country, that they're not allowed to have soldiers in their own territory, which the Rhineland was? Again, reminder, this is not German forces invading a foreign country. They are simply moving back into their own territory from which they had been prohibited for 20 years almost. So the British said, how would we feel if we were prohibited from having soldiers in, say, Yorkshire? So Yorkshire is one of the northern areas of England. And so we would never accept that, the British said. So why do we expect the Germans to accept us telling them they cannot have soldiers in the Rhineland? So once again, the British in particular, but the British and French as a pair, chose not to respond to Hitler's act of remilitarizing the Rhineland. Again, simply saying, well, Germany is an independent, self-governing country. How can we reasonably tell them that they're not allowed to have soldiers on their own territory? As I mentioned, Adolf Hitler knew that had they taken action, he would have had to withdraw. German troops would have had to withdraw. And Hitler added, retreat at that time would have spelled collapse when he was speaking to his advisors later. In other words, he believed that had the British and French taken action to drive his soldiers back out of the Rhineland, it would have spelled the collapse of his government, because he had been telling the German people all along that they were going to stand up to the French. But if they had stood up to the French and the French had then smacked them around, that probably would have discredited Adolf Hitler in the eyes of the German people. And Hitler at least believed that would have led to the collapse of his government. But of course, that's not what happened. The British and French allowed Hitler to do this. And if anything, that just gave him even greater credibility. I'll tell you that Hitler's generals begged him not to do this. The commanders of the German army begged Hitler not to do this. They feared that it would provoke a reaction from the British and French, and that the reaction would result in disastrous consequences for Germany. And Hitler ignored them. He considered that it was a gamble worth taking. He obviously had a better grip on the mentality of the British and French than his generals did. And that's something to know about Adolf Hitler. Remember that Adolf Hitler was a sort of a hero in World War I. He had been decorated twice for his bravery. And meanwhile, a lot of the officers in the German army in 1936, say, had also been officers during the First World War. And as officers, they didn't really experience the difficulties of trench life or the dangers of trench warfare. They sort of operated from behind in the headquarters. And so Hitler more than one time told his generals, I know more about the realities of fighting war than you do. He said that to them many, many times, and he trusted his own instincts more than he trusted their professional experience and opinion. And this is a classic example of that. He did the opposite of what they hoped he would do. They begged him not to do it, and he did it anyway. And of course, it worked for him. And that reaffirmed in his own mind the superiority of his instincts over their professional judgment as military officers. And so over and over again, you'll see this, watch for it. Over and over again during the Second World War, Hitler will ignore his general's opinion and go with what he wants to do, what's in his own instinct. And he will always remind them, when they object, he will always remind them of this instance. You didn't want me to invade the Rhineland either, but it worked. So there's that. So what was this mentality of the British and French that Adolf Hitler seemed to have sniffed out that his generals didn't? What led Britain and France to appease Adolf Hitler and Germany? So first of all, we need to talk about what the word appeasement means. Okay, let's get a definition for the word appeasement. And you see the word appeasement here. And if you're using the unit packet to take your notes, you'll see it at the top of the box. So appeasement means that when you are confronted with demands, when an aggressive person makes demands, rather than resisting, rather than saying no, you give in to those demands. All right? That's what appeasement is. All right? That's what appeasement is. An aggressive person makes demands, and you give in to those demands. Whatever it is that this aggressive person wants from you, you give that person. Now, why do you do it? So that's another part of the definition of appeasement. Why do you do it? Do you do it because you're too weak to say no? That is, you don't have the military might in this case to say no? You're not strong enough to say no? No. Generally speaking, in appeasement, the reason why you do it is to avoid conflict, both in the short term and in the long term. So, of course, by giving into an aggressor's demands, right, by giving a person what they want, in the immediate short term, you avoid conflict because then the person gets what the person wants and the person sort of, I guess, is happy. And although you may be unhappy, you accept your own unhappiness because by making the other person happy, you avoid conflict. So the immediate result of appeasement is to avoid conflict. And the hope is that in the long run, you will also avoid conflict. Because when you appease an aggressive person, what you're hoping is that if you keep giving in to their demands, right? If the person makes demands and you keep giving in to those demands, you hope that eventually the person will run out of demands, that eventually the person will become satisfied and will stop making demands. So that's sort of the long-term hope of a person who is engaged in appeasement. In the short term, avoid conflict by giving the person what the person wants. In the long term, avoid conflict because eventually the person gets everything he wants and stops making demands. So that is appeasement. And this is such an important definition, I'm going to hit it for you one more time. Appeasement means giving in to the demands of an aggressor in the hope of avoiding conflict in the short term, but also in the hope of basically exhausting or extinguishing the person's demands so that you will not have conflict in the long term. That's appeasement. And that is what the British and the French had done with Adolf Hitler, both in the case of him rearming Germany, rebuilding its military, and in the case of him remilitarizing the Rhineland. In both cases, Hitler had made demands. I am repudiating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and I am rebuilding Germany's army. Right? British and French agreed to those demands. They allowed him to do it. They hoped that they could avoid conflict that way. They hoped that he would eventually run out of demands. Then in the case of remilitarizing the Rhineland, I am moving German forces back into the Rhineland. They appeased that demand also. They gave in to that demand in the hope of avoiding conflict and in the hope that he would eventually run out of demands. Now here's the problem with appeasement. The problem with appeasement is, and you can probably predict it yourself. So why don't you take a few seconds and think about what the main problem with appeasement is? So what do you think? What is the biggest problem with appeasement? Well, I think probably the biggest problem is that what if the lesson that is learned for the aggressor is not that that he or she should be satisfied and stop making demands? What if the lesson that is learned is that what if the lesson the aggressor learns is that he or she can make demands and get what they want without really any effort and without any consequences? What if it leads to more demands? And that's the thing. With Adolf Hitler, that's what happened. Appeasement did not lead to fewer demands. It did not lead to Hitler running out of demands and eventually not making demands. It led to him making more demands because he perceived that he could get what he wanted without any consequences, without having to fight the British and French. And so in the case of Hitler, he understood that the British and French would continue to appease him. So it led to more demands. So the question is why? Why were the British and French appeasing Adolf Hitler? Well, on the one hand, you can take at face value the excuse that they sort of gave, which is that, well, after all, the Treaty of Versailles was quite unfair. And how can you really tell an independent, self-governing country that they cannot have their own military or that they cannot have troops on their own territory? But I think when it comes right down to it, although that is true, and it's true that people in Britain in particular were now looking back on the Treaty of Versailles and admitting its unfairness, I think that was more of an excuse. Because I think the real reason for British and French appeasement is the sense of pacifism that had set in on those countries. So what does pacifism mean? Well, pacifism means a desire to preserve peace and a willingness to do it at any cost. All right? So pacifism, a desire to preserve peace and a willingness to do whatever it takes, to pay whatever cost in order to preserve peace. For the British and French, this pacifism, the spirit of pacifism, originated with the horrors of the First World War. You have to remember that the First World War was a catastrophe the likes of which humanity had never experienced. And other than the Germans themselves, the British and the French, I suppose the Russians too, the British and the French had suffered the most as a result of it. Think of it. An entire generation of British and French young men who were either killed, some of them whose bodies were never recovered, and so their families could not even mourn over their dead. An entire generation killed or horribly wounded, maimed, coming back without legs, without arms, with disfigured faces, scars from mustard gas, or at the very least psychologically scarred by the experience of fighting the war. So an entire generation of young men in Britain and France who were affected by the war. The war had bankrupted their treasuries. The war had been a massive disruption in their national lives, particularly in France, where most of the war had been fought in their countryside. It had torn up the French countryside. And so you can understand that the British and French were desiring to avoid a repeat of the First World War. And so they seemed to fear any kind of conflict which might lead to war. And so the spirit of pacifism, the spirit of wanting to avoid war at any cost, the spirit of keeping peace at any cost, originated with the suffering from the First World War and their desire not to repeat it. And so any occasion when Adolf Hitler confronted them and made aggressive demands triggered a sort of a fearful reaction in them that if they pushed back on those demands, it could result in a conflict that could lead to war. And so instead of pushing back, instead of resisting Hitler's demands, they gave in to him. They appeased him. Now, there were people who recognized that this was bad news. And these are two sort of political cartoons of the time, which illustrate the point. The one on the left, you can see Adolf Hitler goose-stepping up this sort of series of steps. And the steps are made out of bodies of people. Now, they're not dead people. They're not dead people. You can see some of them even looking up and even sort of talking to each other. Notice it's labeled spineless leaders of democracy. And so the reason why they're all bent over is not because they're dead. It's because they have no spine. So this particular creator of this cartoon is basically accusing the leaders of Britain and France and other democracies of not having the courage, not having the spine, not having the backbone to stand up to Hitler. And so instead they form this sort of stepping stones to glory. And here's rearmament, and here's the Rhineland remilitarization, and so on, as he climbs up the mountain. This one is actually created. Now, if you look very closely, you might recognize the style of this one, because this one's created by a very famous American cartoonist. Do you know who it is? Well, if you look, you can see it was created by Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss was originally a political cartoonist in his early career before he started writing funny children's books. And he was definitely an opponent of appeasement. And so this one is titled The Appeaser. And you can see here is the appeaser standing on a little island, and he's handing out lollipops. And he's surrounded by these sort of sea creatures who are closing in on him, and they have Nazi symbols, the swastika. And he says, "Remember, one more lollipop, and then you all go home." And that was how Dr. Seuss saw the appeasers, as essentially they were giving these monsters representing Hitler, they were giving them what they wanted, and yet expecting that they would stop making demands. He thought that was absurd. And of course, it turned out to be the case. Now, I want to give you one more example of a demand that Hitler made that the British and French gave into. And so we're going to dip a little bit into section number 2, appeasement and expansion of Hitler's Third Reich. And this first example is an example of how British and French appeasement allowed Adolf Hitler to conquer territories around Germany without fighting a war. And we're going to focus on something called Anschluss and the building of Hitler's Third Reich. So we're just going to do it up at the top of page 6 here. So let's talk about, first of all, the Third Reich. Remember that when Adolf Hitler took over as sort of the Führer, the leader of Germany, after Paul von Hindenburg died, and Hitler ordered the merging of the office of president with that of chancellor, he proclaimed himself Führer, and he proclaimed the establishment of a Third German Reich, a Third German Empire. The German word for empire is Reich. So the Third Reich. So Hitler was now going to build this Reich. And one of the slogans, the guiding slogans of Nazism was Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, which means one nation or one people, that is the German nation or the German people. Ein Reich, one empire. Ein Führer, one leader. So the principle here is that the German nation should all be part of a single German state led by one leader, that is Adolf Hitler, which is why he focused on Austria. So Austria was a state made up of ethnic Germans. The people who lived in Austria now were all ethnic Germans. Now remember, in the old Austrian Empire, which basically occupied all of this space, only 10% were ethnic Germans, and the rest were nations who'd been conquered by them. But after World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been dismantled, and Little Austria, all that was left of it was Little Austria, and that was all ethnic Germans. And what Adolf Hitler wanted to achieve was called Anschluss. And the word's kind of covered up here. So it's Anschluss. And again, if you're working with your unit packet, you can see it in the little box there. Anschluss. So the word Anschluss simply means connection. And what Adolf Hitler wanted was for Austria to now become connected to Germany, to basically absorb Austria into Germany, so that this would be a progression toward the goal of having all German people living in one German empire, one German Reich. So Austria, since it was entirely made up of ethnic Germans, was now to be connected to Germany and become part of the German Reich under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Ein Volk, one nation; ein Reich, one empire; ein Führer, one leader. So Hitler got into contact with the Chancellor of Austria, whose name was Kurt von Schuschnigg. Kurt von Schuschnigg. Now, Kurt von Schuschnigg and about half of the Germans in Austria were determined to keep Austria independent. They did not want Austria to become part of Germany. Austria had historically been its own proud, independent state, at one time one of the most powerful states of Europe. And many Austrians were proud of that history, and they did not wish to see themselves, despite the fact that it would allow all the German people to come under the rule of one German state and one German leader. Many Austrians did not see that as a good thing. They wanted Austria to continue to be independent. And Kurt von Schuschnigg was one of them. So Adolf Hitler, in order to sort of undermine von Schuschnigg's authority, he actually established a Nazi party in Austria. And he funded them. He provided money and encouragement to them. And remember that Austria was a democracy. Austria was a democracy. Kurt von Schuschnigg was its chancellor. Austria had its own parliament, to which the Austrian people elected representatives. And so what Hitler was trying to do by establishing a Nazi party in Austria was effectively to do what he had done in Germany. He wanted Austria's Nazi party to slowly rise and run in elections and gain seats in the Austrian parliament and eventually take over the government. And so Austria's Nazi party began to function, and they had their own brown shirts. There was an equivalent of the brown shirts. So Austrian Nazis were also storming around the streets, beating up communists and sort of trying to intimidate people. And Kurt von Schuschnigg knew exactly what was going on here. He fully understood that Adolf Hitler was trying to replicate in Austria what he had done in Germany, achieving a Nazi takeover through the democratic process. And so Kurt von Schuschnigg did the smart thing. He ordered the arrest of all the Nazis. So all across Austria, Nazis were arrested, rounded up, and imprisoned. And of course, that outraged Adolf Hitler. So Hitler now demanded to speak to Kurt von Schuschnigg. And they met. The two of them met face to face. And Adolf Hitler demanded that Kurt von Schuschnigg release all of the Nazis from prison. All of those Nazi brown shirts who had been put in prison in Austria were to be immediately released. And he demanded that they be released, and also that one of them, the leader of them, be placed in charge of Austria's, basically of their internal security. This is like putting the wolf in charge of the hen house. And Kurt von Schuschnigg understood what the consequences of that would be. To release all the brown shirts from prison and to put a Nazi in charge of his own internal security would be to basically hand over Austria to the Nazis. Or as he said, "You're asking me to sign Austria's death warrant." And he refused to do it. He refused. And so Adolf Hitler said, "Well, if you will refuse to do it, then I will have no choice but to invade Austria, to march on Austria." And Kurt von Schuschnigg said, "Well, if that's what you mean, then the British and French will never let you get away with it. The British and French will never let you get away with invading Austria." And Hitler laughed. This is 1938 now, spring of 1938, 2 years after remilitarizing the Rhineland. Hitler laughed and said, "England and France will not lift a finger for Austria. When I remilitarized the Rhineland, I took a great risk The French could have driven me back out then if they had wanted to, but now it's too late for them. And so Kurt von Schuschnigg said, okay, I'll do what you say. I will release the Nazis from prison. I will appoint a Nazi to the head of our internal security. And Hitler was satisfied. But when Kurt von Schuschnigg went back to Austria, instead, he ordered what's called a plebiscite. And you've heard of a plebiscite before. We talked about Napoleon. It's a vote in which you're essentially asking the people to register their opinion officially. It's not binding, doesn't force the government into any particular action, but you at least get an official register of the people's opinion. And what Kurt von Schuschnigg wanted to know from the Austrian people was, do you want to remain independent or do you want to become part of Germany? His hope was that the Austrian people would say that they wanted to remain independent, and so that even if Adolf Hitler did invade and take over Austria, at least the rest of Europe would know that this is not what Austria wanted. And he hoped that the League of Nations or the British and French or somebody would stand up for Austria. It was a bit of a gamble, though, because although there were many in Austria who wanted Austria to remain independent, there were also many who favored the idea of joining with Germany, who favored the idea of all Germans under the leadership of the German state and the German Führer. So it was a bit of a gamble, but in the end, he never got to take it. Hitler wouldn't let him. Because as soon as Hitler learned that von Schuschnigg had called for this plebiscite, he ordered Austria to be invaded. German forces crossed over the border and invaded Austria. And Kurt von Schuschnigg basically told the Austrian army to stand down. There was no real hope of successfully defending Austria against the German army. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years into German rearmament now, 4 years into German rearmament, the German army had been built up to a level of might and power that dwarfed whatever Austria could throw up against it. And so Kurt von Schuschnigg sort of accepted that Austria was now to be taken over. So instead of ordering the Austrian army to fight, leading to the shedding of Austrian blood, he simply ordered them to stand down. And the German forces quickly took over Austria. This is actually Adolf Hitler re-entering Vienna. Vienna was the capital of Austria, but if you remember, it's also the city where Adolf Hitler was born and where he grew up. Remember that Adolf Hitler was a German, ethnically German, but born in Austria. And so this is Hitler in his car re-entering the city. And you can see that there was a lot of support. A lot of people came out in support to cheer for Adolf Hitler because Austria really was quite a divided country. There were those who wanted it to remain independent, but there were certainly hundreds of thousands who favored union with Germany, that would make Austria strong again by uniting with Germany. Was Hitler right about the British and French not lifting a finger for Austria? Yes. Yes, he was. Once again, when confronted with a German violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles had explicitly stated that Germany and Austria could not be united. And now he's actually invaded another country. This is not the Rhineland, where he's simply moving German forces into German territory. This was an invasion of another country. This shouldn't be allowed. Countries shouldn't allow this to happen. The League of Nations shouldn't allow this to happen. But once again, the British and the French appeased Adolf Hitler in Germany. They took no action when Adolf Hitler ordered the invasion and the takeover of Austria. And so Austria became part of the Third Reich. The Anschluss, the connecting of Germany and Austria by force, was achieved. So now you've seen 3 examples of violations of the Treaty of Versailles by Adolf Hitler in Germany. The rearming of Germany, the rebuilding of its military, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and Anschluss, the invasion of Austria and the incorporation of it into the German Third Reich. But this was just the beginning of appeasement. And you'll see that in the long run, it was British and French appeasement that allowed Adolf Hitler to take over most of Central Europe without having to fight a war. And this then positioned Germany to be so strong at the beginning of the Second World War. All right, so you can see where we're going in our next lesson. I look forward to teaching you that lesson. But until then, I hope you're able to stay healthy and safe. Take care of yourselves, world history students. Bye-bye.